Welcome to Season 2 of the BeanPod, a podcast about decentralized finance and the Beanstalk protocol. I'm your host, Rex. Before we get started, we'd like to again remind everyone that we here at the podcast are super bullish about Beanstalk protocol and other DeFi projects. But as we've seen time and time again, this is still a risky space. So with that in mind, always do your own research before investing in a project, including anything covered here in the podcast, and never ever invest funds that you can't afford to lose. And with that, on with the show. Hello, farmers. After taking a short hiatus, the BeanPod is back, and we couldn't be happier. Now, while we were away, the farm stayed busy, and now we find ourselves on the cusp of what has been casually referred to as Beanstalk's Mayflower update. This package of improvements will have a significant impact on Beanstalk's utility, governance, and operation. And this episode of the podcast focuses on the latter. Now, those of you who are familiar with Beanstalk will probably recognize the term sunrise. For those that aren't, to kick off every new hour, Beanstalk performs what you could call a system check that we refer to as a sunrise. During the check, Beanstalk re-examines its token balances and price. If it's above peg, it issues newly minted beans to stock, pod, and fertilizer holders. On the other hand, if Beanstalk is below peg, sunrise is when the protocol determines the amount of debt it's willing to issue to bring the price back up to where it should be, and the percentage of yield it's willing to pay to entice those interested in lending to it. Either way, this function is absolutely critical to Beanstalk's continued operation. When Beanstalk first started, the sunrise function was called by whoever happened to be sitting by their computer at the time, and it paid out 100 beans as a reward to that individual. As seasons began to climb, however, it became more and more apparent that paying such a high amount every hour wasn't in the protocol's best interests. Similarly, the community has raised concerns about the amount of debt the protocol has taken on over its lifetime, and the development team has been tasked with finding ways to mitigate that debt, while at the same time maintaining the free market ideals that underpin the protocol. To learn more about the approach to these improvements, today I'm talking with two of Beanstalk's developers, Brean and Chaikitty. Brean and Chaikitty, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, hey, this is Chaikitty. Good to be on.
So to start us off, would you like to tell us just a little bit about what you do for Beanstalk in the dev role?
Yeah, so for Beanstalk Farms, I'm a Solidity developer. Me and among other users, we try to, write some code and try to upgrade Beanstalk, into a state where it becomes more self-sufficient and, optimizes many parameters, such as peg maintenance or, develop future tools in which other developers can build upon to fully make Beanstalk a fully composable stack and be the best it can be.
Yeah, so for me, I actually don't work with Beanstalk Farms. This is actually the first contribution that I've made to Beanstalk, what we're going to be talking about today. Aside from that, I think I've done a little bit of minor stuff here and there. I think I helped find a couple bugs on the UI in the past. But yeah, this is kind of my main contribution so far. But, who knows what maybe I'll do in the future as well.
Yeah, love it. Brean, it's been a pleasure to get to know you and your work over the last year or so. And Chaikitty, welcome to the team. So to jump right into what we're going to be talking about today, one of the first improvements that Beanstalk is rolling out as part of the Mayflower update is focused on the sunrise function. And really, to be fair, it's actually a couple of improvements to sunrise that are being grouped together. But before we get into the improvements, could you talk us through what the sunrise function is and why it's important?
Yeah, so the sunrise function is Beanstalk's way to keep time and as well as to observe the state of itself. Every hour, any user, external or internal, can call this sunrise function, given that it's the correct amount of time, has elapsed between the sunrise functions, we call them seasons, but time-wise, they're 1 hour. And doing so, Beanstalk does, the necessary calculations to check its state and gives and rewards the user who called it some beans. It's important for the sunrise function to be called because, without it, Beanstalk's unable to, you know, check on itself, for example, or check the state of Beanstalk. And the reason why that's important is because Beanstalk constantly updates, you know, its state based on that. Basically, you can kind of imagine Beanstalk as a boat and it's guiding towards a destination. Well, every hour it checks, the wind, the, speed of the boat, yada, yada, yada. And, accurately changes directions, bit by bit to properly and optimize its way towards a destination.
All right, that's great. So, with the current setup, every season, every hour, there is that opportunity for Beanstalk to check its bearings. And that's typically done by a user calling the sunrise function. And essentially, you've got theoretically, it could be users sitting and actually watching the user interface or by themselves. But in most cases now, it's some type of automated bot setup that folks have engineered to call that function and receive rewards. Why can that be problematic? Why is it not as efficient as it could be?
Yeah, so I can speak to this one. The reason why Beanstalk relies on some third party, you could call it some bot operator to be calling the function, is that it's very important for Beanstalk, like Brean mentioned, that it is always called every hour and as quickly as possible. So to that end, it must incentivize users to do so by providing some monetary reward. And that's because in order to place the transaction on Ethereum, it costs gas. So the idea with the reward is that we need to one, compensate for calling the function, but also provide some amount of profit so that people are incentivized to do so, to operate the bot, to do it, to make sure that it's happening consistently and so forth.
So it sounds like what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, hey, if somebody's got a bot in operation that's calling the sunrise function, there's going to be a certain network fee that's essentially unavoidable and variable depending on network load, could vary really pretty significantly. And then on top of that, there should be some type of incentive so that whoever is operating that bot or whoever is calling that function, let's say, has some type of incentive beyond break even. It sounds like the goal is to try to make both of those things as efficient as possible, right?
Yeah. So for reference, currently Beanstalk pays around 25 beans, which is a decrease from the original incentive. The original incentive was 100 beans. However, this static value isn't as efficient on the EVM. So for example, let's say, the execution cost of that transaction is around $10, right? And let's assume $1 is one bean, there's a 15 bean margin in which what really occurs is that, no one just calls the sunrise function, with the base fee or with the, average price of an execution and get that $15 of beans. What really happens is that these bots are very competitive. They look at each other's transactions and they see, oh, there's a $15 margin. I'm willing to call the sunrise with $14 margin. So they'll increase the gas price such that they will be the first one in the blockchain and therefore get the sunrise reward. And then another bot comes in and says, oh, I'm down for $13. And it's a huge competition and it keeps going until the margin is around, let's say $3 or so, So what occurs is that even though Beanstalk is paying 25 beans to, incentivize people to call to Sunrise, truly we're paying around $10 of that, or a non-insignificant amount to the validators of the EVM due to this competition-based nature. And the crux of that issue is based on the fact that we don't factor in the state of the EVM or the state of the blockchain when issuing these beans. So, what Chaikitty's Sunrise Improvements part aims to solve is to include some of that into the calculation of issuing beans, such that Beanstalk pays the minimum or a more efficient manner needed to properly incentivize someone to call the Sunrise function in all conditions. There are some times actually where the Sunrise improvements, the 25 beans wasn't enough to incentivize people to go in. During I don't know, NFT mints or the like, gas was so high that 25 beans wasn't enough to incentivize a user. So that's sometimes we see 1 block, 2 block, perhaps even 3 block delays in calling Sunrise. So this also solves that edge case as well. And so ultimately, this should provide a more steady, a consistent profit to the bots calling the Sunrise function.
How many bots do you think there are competing to complete the Sunrise function in a given season, a given hour?
Rex, your guess is as good as mine. We honestly have no clue. I would say at least a couple, like four, at least four, we feel. But honestly, we have no clue, right? And it's four. Maybe it's four right now during the less volatile times of Beanstalk, but perhaps when things picks up again, maybe even more people will be incentivized to call it Sunrise. And ultimately, having more of these bots, it's good for Beanstalk given it increases decentralization and calling the Sunrise function, right? That's one of the key reasons why we made it such that Beanstalk's farm is not the only one who calls Sunrise, right? Otherwise, that introduces a centralization vector. It's great that anybody in the world can call the Sunrise to make Beanstalk keep chugging along, right? And ultimately, that's the only thing Beanstalk needs to keep chugging along. So I think that's that's great.
Absolutely. And so, kind of as another follow up to that, who develops these bots? I mean, and maybe it's somebody in this discussion. If it is, that's fine. Hey, no judgment here. It's not me, that's for sure. But I guess really the question that I have is, are there folks that are not part of the community that had the technical skill? They were like, hey, I can develop this bot, and I'm a Solidity developer, and I don't have any other interaction with Beanstalk besides the Sunrise function. But I had the time and the wherewithal to put together a bot that would help, make me a few dollars an hour competitively, compared to these whatever other bots are competing.
You're not a bot guy. You didn't create the Sunrise bot. I don't know, man. That sounds like someone who did make the bot would say.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's it.
I mean, the landscape of EVM is just so vast. Initially during the early days of Beanstalk, calling the Sunrise is expensive. And what actually occurred is that bots that weren't into Beanstalk just merely checked the mempool and saw that calling this one function, because you have to think about it from the bot perspective. Or these bots, they scan the whole mempool, they see someone call a function, and they don't know what the function does. It's a black box from their perspective. All they see is that you called a function, some ERC20 is issued, and that ERC20 happened to have a pool to change for ETH. From their perspective, that bot will see that and, will bot it. So during the early days, what occurred is that these external users who aren't Beanstalk native users, actually, they saw the Sunrise function and just called it and, subsequently sold their beans to the pool, right? And that's what kind of ushered in, this need to really invigorate the community, to educate the community and, get them to run their own bots too. These people who won't be as nefarious as these MEV, searchers within the mempool.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at is that like and again, this is obviously how much of a novice I am to some of these technical aspects. But that is what went through my mind is like, are there people with a technical ability that can create bots that are essentially scanning the entirety of the Ethereum ecosystem looking for those opportunities to nab, you know, whatever bits and pieces of whatever coins they can, as long as those coins can be traded for ETH. That's it sounds like that's kind of what I was imagining, where you've got folks that are like, hey, I don't know anything about Beanstalk, but I know how to create this thing that could do this, that can perform this function, and so that is how I'm gonna make my money.
Yeah. Well, the great thing is, as Beanstalk scales up and more people and more eyes look at Beanstalk, inevitably people who are a major Beanstalk farmers will call the Sunrise function with their own bots and, ideally not sell their beans and, keep it as their own, savings account or whatnot, right? Of course, they'll have to sell. They would have to sell eventually to, cover gas costs. But the hope is that the profit margin stays within beans, and I think ultimately that's what's kind of happening today. So it's great to see that all coming into fruition.
No, that's very fair. So now Chai Kitty, it sounds like this approach that you're taking helps to kind of hit the sweet spot of managing both, taking network cost into account and, managing the competitive nature of the bots to minimize the cost to Beanstalk, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Kind of how Brean mentioned, the reason why we have the 25 beans, but at least just looking on Etherscan at some of the recent ones, for the amount of beans that were received versus the cost in ETH that was incurred, the margin is actually very small, and where that money is going is just to the validator of the block. So in this case, it kind of, I guess it kind of helps everybody except except the validator.
So, can you walk us through a little bit about how the improvements to the Sunrise function will help to optimize that process?
So it's really a couple things. The primary goal of it is just to reduce bean issuance and, by extension, bean sell pressure. And the reasons for that is this is something that, as we've discussed, is kind of just called by advanced users, bot operators. Most people in the Beanstalk ecosystem probably aren't really even aware that this is happening every hour. It just kind of happens. At the top of the hour, it's completed. Oh, we've gone to the next season. So in that sense, like there's not really much else to gain out of it other than the reduction in bean issuance. But basically, what I've done is created a way to essentially check exactly how many beans correspond to the cost of Ethereum in order to perform a transaction. So, let's say they submit, and this really could work for any transaction. Right now, it's only applied to Sunrise, but we can basically see, okay, they called Sunrise, it made these adjustments to the temperature. Maybe it distributed, some amount of beans to silo, to pod line and fertilizer holders. And then it cost, let's just say it costs like 20,000 gas to complete that operation. Then it can determine, okay, what is the cost of that 20,000 gas? How much Ethereum is that? How much Ethereum is essentially going to be taken from the caller of that function? With that value, it can actually compare through a couple of calculations exactly how many beans is that equivalent of Ethereum that the transaction cost. So it does so by getting the Ethereum price in dollars and then the Bean price in dollars, and then essentially comparing the two to say, okay, this transaction cost $10 worth of Ethereum. Okay, so then that's $10 worth of Beans. And then in the case of the Sunrise, depending on exactly what parameters are given to it or how quickly it was called, we'll add a few dollars on top of that in order to kind of how we were saying make it profitable for the person doing it. But that's really the idea. It's just to basically ensure that we're giving a fair compensation and to ensure that we're not issuing much more than needed. And kind of the impetus for this was prior to the replant, the Sunrise incentive, the base reward was starting at 100 beans. And at the time, that made a lot of sense because gas prices were very high. I remember my first interaction with Beanstalk. I sewed some beans into the pod line. I think my gas fees were like $70 or something like that. So it was definitely appropriate at the time. But after the replant, it kind of became clear as both Ethereum price itself had dropped, and then the general gas costs were lower as well. That 100 was a bit excessive. And then so this was developed after reducing it to 25. We wanted a more robust solution to kind of accommodate for all the different possible conditions.
Yeah, so what you end up with is a system where Beanstalk itself is making a clever calculation to determine that gas fee, saying, okay, here's what it costs, whatever, entity is doing it, whatever bot is doing or whatever. And hey, here's a little bit of a premium on top of that to keep you coming back to make it worth your while. But really, the difference between whatever that is and the current issuance of 25 beans per season, that amount is kept by Beanstalk. It's not issued. And when you start multiplying that by 24 every day, by 365 days per year, it doesn't take long until you get into a really pretty significant amount.
Yes, that's correct. I think there's been some historical calculations done on exactly what those differences would be with the actual versus what it would be under this change. I don't know if that's completed yet, but I think we'll be seeing that at some point as well. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Just $5, $10, even $15 every hour can add up pretty quickly.
Yeah, doing quick, math in my head is just as we're sitting here, you're easily talking about tens of thousands of dollars per year in terms of fees that aren't paid out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So another part of the Sunrise improvement is how Beanstalk determines the return that lenders get for lending to the protocol. Now, inside of Beanstalk, we call that the temperature. The improvement uses what's called a Dutch auction with an increasing interest rate. But could you talk us through what that actually means?
Would be happy to. Beanstalk, every season when the Sunrise function is called, updates the temperature, or I guess, the interest rate in which Beanstalk's willing to lend or to borrow against, right? An absolute plus or minus 3% a season, right? And this is very intentional, nowadays temperature is very high, but the change is very low. And this is, we do this intentionally because we want Beanstalk to be reactive, but not too reactive. We need Beanstalk to be reactive enough such that the market can react to the change in temperature, right? Our thesis is that there is some temperature any external user is willing to sell in order to, get pods, right? But if Beanstalk gets there too fast, there's not enough time for the market to react. Now, conversely, what we've seen prior to the exploit is that, during the deleveraging period, there was a significant demand for people to sow their beans into soil, into pods, right? And conversely, that's what caused the temperature to go down. But during this sudden shift in large demand, the temperature was going down. But the reality is, we believe that a lot of people would have been willing to sow their beans for a significantly lower temperature than the one given, right? We have this very static temperature. So what occurs is now Beanstalk issues more debt than it needs to in order to incentivize people to sow their beans, right? So what the Dutch auction creates is now we introduce some reflexivity in the temperature towards the downside. So starting for the first 5 blocks, or apologies, 25 blocks, the first 5 minutes, which we dubbed the morning of the season, Beanstalk now starts the temperature at a very small, 1%, and over the course of the 25 blocks, increases the temperature until it reaches its full amount after 25 blocks. Now we have this period in which, let's say there's a lot of excess demand for sowing soil. Now instead of someone instantly sowing soil, with a full temperature, they can gauge at which block or at which temperature they really want that soil. And ultimately, this causes, Beanstalk to issue less debt in order to, incentivize people to get that soil.
So right now, the temperature is very high. We're well over 9,000% temperature. In fact, we're over 10,000% temperature. And one of the concerns that the community has had is that this level of return in terms of pods creates a situation where the potential future debt of the protocol might not be sustainable, or at least it's going to be extremely large because of essentially the amount of return that anybody is getting for sowing any beans or burning any beans to buy pods. So it sounds like this is really built to directly address that concern through a competitive system that, if I'm right, so a block is like 10 seconds. So like the first 4 or 5 minutes of a given hour, that temperature is increasing, if I'm understanding this correctly?
Yes. Well, me personally, I don't think Beanstalk's at that very extreme state yet. I think it's a very healthy state, even with these very high temperatures. From my perspective, this temperature is well more than enough to, well, not in that extreme region to say. But yes, it does introduce competitiveness into the market, into the sowing market now, right? Do you risk waiting the full 5 minutes and getting that full temperature, or are you willing to take, let's say, 80% of the temperature to ensure you get those soil to sow, right? Because what we've seen is that demand is very volatile, right? Some days, in times, right now there's a very low period, but when demand picks up, it picks up and it encourages more demand, right? So this whole Ducks auction really gives us that opportunity to take the most advantage out of that, sudden surge of demand, right? So ultimately, we think this is not a solution per se, but not a band-aid solution either. Maybe it is a solution, but one of the main an additional tool for farmers to utilize when they're deciding, when to sow, and better optimize for beanstalk overall.
So if I heard you right a minute ago, so the max temperature is still going to move based on that set of parameters that's in the current white paper. 1%, 3%, 0%, -1 or -3, if I'm recalling it correctly. That max will still float in that non-reflexive manner, but really what's changing is the steps that the protocol takes to get to that, correct?
Yes. And it's good. It's a good note to say that now let's say we implement this morning auction. We can go a step further and utilize that temperature, for future max temperature changes. Right. And right now we only change, plus -3%. But another thing we're discussing is that okay, now we have this mechanism to see what the average temperature is to sell, right? Let's say there's a huge surge of demand and the average temperature in which Beanstalk sells during that last season is 10% of the max, right? You know, from my perspective, it does feel that that warrants a larger decrease in temperature than the -3% we have today, right? So this Dutch auction introduces another level, another axis of in which Beanstalk can optimize for, right? It sets a foundation for that, right? Obviously hasn't been fully specced out yet. A lot of other things to do. It's always a busy day on the farm, but these things, build on top of each other. These systems build on top of each other. And ultimately, creates a more balanced, more robust, and great system that Beanstalk can, use. Right.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that if every hour whatever soil is available is sown into pods at 80% of the max temp over some time horizon, some period of time, that will eventually could theoretically be used to help determine what that max temperature would be. And then conversely, if there's a period of time where it always moves to its maximum every, or like we're seeing right now, there's soil that's left on the table, that would be, that stronger signal to continue to increase, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Ultimately, it's another indication of what soil demand is. Right. We ultimately need more gauges on what demand is for soil, and this adds another axis. So great stuff.
So, one more thing that I wanted to capture when we're talking about this sunrise improvement package, this group of improvements, is the interoperability with the farm function. And it's pretty niche for folks that aren't part of Beanstalk already. We might need just a little bit of explanation there. Brean or Chaikitty, either you want to talk us through what that actually means?
So I think the idea here is that if if one of the bot operators is calling the sunrise function, if let's say they wanted to call sunrise and then with the beans they received, maybe they want to silo them, or maybe they want to, use them to sow, or they want to sell them, or whatever it may be. We basically are providing an easy way for them to get at the runtime of the function to see exactly how many beans they're going to be receiving. So it's really just a way to help them chain function calls together, if you will. And I believe there's also an option to send it to either the internal or the external balance of their wallet. Yeah, not sure if I missed anything else there, but that's more of like an advanced feature. And in practice, I don't think we expect that will really be used, but it was kind of easy to add support for that in. So maybe one day that'll be useful. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, we noticed that everything's all hindsight's 2020, but we realized that after we implemented the farm function and the depot and pipeline, we realized that a lot of our functions don't have the ability to compose within one to another. For example, with the sunrise, we don't actually return the amount that's received, or the ability to return it into the internal balances and things like these. They're very little and they're very small quality of life changes, but we've really taken a step back and really thought to ourselves, okay, how do we make these functions within Beanstalk composable with each other and throughout the whole EVM, right? And within DeFi and within, BeanPod itself, right? And, you know, this is just one of the many changes we'll be implementing, in the next couple months, and we'll really see this to fruition in the Silo v3 update, for instance, right, where a lot of these functions will be more composable, using depot and pipeline, and hopefully these small changes will compound to greater changes and turn the tides of what Beanstalk can do.
Yes, that's the point that I would want to emphasize with this. And you guys hit it. Is that like in and of itself, yeah, this is pretty niche because this is something that is going to be utilized by someone that's probably running a bot that would have to understand. They would have to understand how Beanstalk works and the most advantageous way to potentially use whatever their sunrise reward was. But two things. First is, yeah, it's a really good opportunity to avoid the sell pressure, to manage the sell pressure, because if you have somebody that's knowledgeable about what's going on inside of Beanstalk and they think, hey, I can capture a pretty solid rate of return by taking, whatever my premium is that I got for calling the sunrise function and sticking it in the silo. But if I was going to pay the gas fee to do that, I'd be nullifying that reward to do two transactions. But if I can link the sunrise function to the ability to deposit into the silo, then it's a pretty gas efficient way for me as the bot developer to take that reward and theoretically multiply it. The other piece is that this is a really good early example of some of the new composability and functionality that we're going to see from Silo v3 and the broader pipeline program, this ability to take multiple transactions that in the past would not have been especially gas efficient or may have theoretically involved moving funds in and out of balances that could theoretically hit your wallet and trying to manage all those pieces in a really clever way. This is a good example of what is kind of out on the horizon, right?
Yeah, exactly. Currently sunrise callers have to do the sunrise function. They have to then call another function to deposit in the silo. Horrible UX. Like, what are we doing here, right? Just minimizing that from 2 to 1. Amazing, right? These small things just keep people who are interested in the system, even more interested in the system, right? Now you're incentivized to stay within the system rather than sell your beans into ETH, right? It just really all compounds. It's great stuff.
Just building that farm one new farmer at a time. Well, thank you both so much. This is really informative. I mean, it's great to see the improvements that are happening around Beanstalk. And man, I can't wait to see these pieces come together and then all the stuff that's going to be going on in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Rex.
Yeah, thanks, Rex. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And, hopefully we talk more.
Absolutely. Can't wait. And as a final reminder, keep an eye out for the Sunrise Improvement BIP, also known as BIP 34, which should be up for snapshot votes soon. The BeanPod is a production of Beanstalk Farms, a decentralized autonomous organization. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Medium, Discord, and our home on the web at bean.money. You can also find me on Twitter at RexTheBean. And as a final reminder, this podcast is not financial advice. Thanks again for listening.